Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, 2 weeks ago, in fact, 12 days ago, maybe 11, along with Mag and my friends David and Stephanie, I visited Colditz Castle in Germany. Precisely, it's in Lower Saxony. And today I'm going to talk to you about my experiences there and share my photos and hopefully address some of your questions. So I'm going to start by saying, and you know this already, I'm a 55-year-old British male. And if you're not of that age group, and perhaps you're not British, you may not know just how much of a hold Colditz and the story of the castle, the Offlag, has on my generation. It was one of the first things I remember being aware about in terms of World War II. And so if you didn't grow up in Britain, or you didn't grow up watching the TV series, it was on in France as well, you may not have that same connection. So I'll start with some photos. And this is the first thing was there was a movie made in 1955 with John Mills and Eric Portman, The Colditz Story. I rewatched it a couple of weeks ago. It's of its time. It's a little bit light-hearted. It isn't terribly kind of serious. You don't feel any real peril, even when they're trying to escape. You sense that it's going to get a ticking off from the Germans and put in solitary, which is kind of what was happening at Colditz Castle. But that was a film I'd seen as a young kid. But for me, it was the Colditz TV show. So it was first aired in 1972 when I was 3, and it carried on till 1974. I must have seen it repeated 3 or 4 years later. I must have seen it sometime, I don't know, 78, 79, something like that, when I was 9 or 10. That's, I guess, when I would have seen it. 26 parts. David, who I traveled with, has just started watching it again. Now, I bought the DVDs a few years ago, and it had Edward Hardwicke, Robert Wagner, David McCallum, lots of kind of classic British actors. Jack Hedley was the senior British officer, and it followed the 2 books by Major Pat Reed. And Major Pat Reed was a prisoner of Colditz Castle. And as a kid, I seem to remember that he was on TV all the time. One of my early books, I'll put it on my screen a bit, which I've had in my collection since I was a kid, is this one here, Escape Stories by Pat Reed. It's even, I don't know when I got it, but it's even signed by Pat Reed, where you can see that on under the thing there. And I had a whole plethora of escape books. It seemed that it was all over the place, and it wasn't just on TV. It was the comics had escape stories, and Colditz Castle, or castles that were Colditz-esque, were kind of always in my comics as a kid. So that's the TV show. And the board game. And David and I were talking about this when we were away 2 weeks ago. The board game was everyone looked forward to playing it, and actually it wasn't that easy to play. Someone had to be the Germans, and then the rest of the players, one would be the British escape team, the French, the Dutch, the Poles, etc. And it seemed to take an eternity to collect bits of rope and collect wire cutters, and you'd just be gathering your men ready for escape, and the Germans would call an appel, and you have to go in there. But I remember playing that a lot as a kid, and it was, it's still available. You no longer can buy the box with the swastika on it. It's now got an eagle on it. And then later, I guess it was later, there was a Spectrum. I had a ZX Spectrum when I was a young teenager, maybe 12 or 13. And there was a Colditz Spectrum game. I think there was 2 or 3 Colditz games you could play. So Colditz was just part of my upbringing. As I've got older, and I had the same reaction, if you remember my Stalag Luft 3 show from last week, I completely understand. As Ham and Jam said, it was blooming difficult, the board game. It just took ages, and you end up kind of getting bored before you actually finished a game. And anyway, I understand now that a lot of the Colditz story is kind of permeated from the point of view of the upper class. It was mostly the posh officers who ended up there. They didn't have the experiences of the other ranks who were in some of the nastier, less well-equipped prison camps across the Third Reich. Colditz, was pretty reasonable. Okay, when you're there, you realize, yes, the windows were a bit, they let the wind in, and it was a bit cold. But compared to some of the other prisoner of war camps, it was luxury. And as Colin said, nobody ever wanted to be the Germans when you played the board game, because the only good bit about being the German was you could play the card shoot to kill, which meant you could kill a prisoner if they were within 12 dice throws or something. You could kill them. But the TV show, the books, the growing up with this was all part of my childhood. And as I've got older, as I said, I realize now that the Colditz experience wasn't really representative of what the Allied prisoners of war were dealing with generally. But nothing takes anything away from the fact it was a place that was high on my list of wanting to see. And I can't believe it took me 55 years to get there, but I did. And thanks to David and Stephanie, the dream to go there became a reality. And we arrived. We had stayed about 20 kilometers, maybe a bit less, south in Rochlitz. And then we drove up there, and we were there really early. The castle didn't open until 10 o'clock. We were there 9. We just managed to get a bakery before it closed at 9. Who thinks of closing a bakery at 9 on a Sunday morning? But it did. But they just managed to serve us kind of a croissant-y thing, and they did a cup of coffee for those who drank it. And then we were there in Colditz. And at this point, for David and me, it was kind of like we were 12 again. As we walked up. And we could have parked. There's a wartime contemporary photo of the castle. We could have driven up to the castle. We decided we'd walk up through the village. And this photo we took from just around the corner where we got the croissant things from the bakery. And I think we both had exactly the same reaction when we looked up and saw the castle there. We're kind of pinching ourselves that there we actually were beneath this famous castle, beneath this place that we had kind of grown up reading about, thinking about, and now we were on the brink of visiting it. And we walked up through this, what would in the summer be a reasonably pretty little German town. In November, with a grey sky, it was a little bit less pretty, and it was a Sunday, and nothing was open. But as we could see the castle there, actually, in a weird way, I'll get to this later, actually seeing it from underneath was almost better than actually going there. That thing where your expectation is really high, and David had the theme tune for the TV series sort of playing on his phone, and we kind of looked up at it there, and we saw that castle, and it was, there's the little village itself. And one of the stories of Colditz is that there was a German dentist. The prisoners were allowed to be taken down to the dentist, and one of the prisoners had an affair with the German dental assistant or something. And the dentist turned out to be part of the resistance or something, and blah blah blah. It's all part of the story. I'm not going to repeat the story of the Colditz offlag. I'm just going to talk about my experiences. And there's is the castle from the side where the main entrance is. Which, as you're looking at it there, the left-hand side was on the other side of that was the German Kommandantur, and the right-hand side was where the prisoner kind of compound was. And there's a view from outside of it, and the area down to the bottom right is the area within the grounds that was where the prisoners were walked down to, I think, every day for exercise. And one of the interesting things about the tour we took there, and I'll get to the private tour we took a bit later on, is that the guide who we engaged was also a medievalist. He wasn't just a World War II person, and he talked about the whole history of the castle and the region, going back to 1,000 years of history. And a couple of hundred years ago was this big walled estate with ornamental kind of Versailles type gardens, all since long gone through various wars and changes and border changes and stuff like that. But it was a hunting ground. It was a bit like the New Forest in the UK, the area around Colditz Castle. So we got some of the back. There's Mag there standing below it. There is a photo of me, but it's on Mag's phone, not my phone, so I haven't uploaded it. And that's the kind of the walk down, or one of the walks down to the area to the right, which is the exercise area, which a couple of escapes were made from there, famously. Alain Loret, who later became a French resistance leader in the Vercors, escaped by kind of hiding under a pile of leaves or something. Another Frenchman escaped, and you've seen this in the Colditz story film, by just simply vaulting over the fence and running. You see it in the movie there. His friend kind of put his hands in a shape, and he just kind of sprang him up over the fence. The Germans weren't expecting it. I can't tell you just how moving it was and how exciting it was to actually walk up to this the gates of this guy. There were two entrances, and we kind of went in each one at different times for different experience. The one where you come in from the side I took those photos was the side where you come in to the Kommandantur from kind of the side where the exercise area is. But we really wanted to come in over the kind of the sort of the moat where you kind of go over a bridge. That was the bit that meant a lot to us. This is the larger of the courtyard. This is the one that was the German Kommandantur. The prisons are beyond that far wall there. And one of you said in a sidebar that it looks like a hotel. Well, this bit is actually a youth hostel. But you have to stay in dormitories and things like that. And I could go into a whole tangent of the fact that the hotel we stayed in probably was the worse quality than if we just booked the dormitory in the youth hostel and actually stayed in the castle. But whatever. The castle's about the castle, like any castle in Europe, it's been built and destroyed and built and destroyed and built and destroyed numerous times. So there was like an old Motte and Bailey there about 1500 years ago. Then it was built and burnt down, then built and burnt down. So some of the foundations go back, hundreds of years, and the main part of the castle we're looking at there is sort of 17th, 18th, and then into the 19th century. So it's quite a extensive program of improvements and change, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that the prisoners were able to make such good use of it, is that there were so many kind of hidden passages and rooms that were blocked up and doors that had been concealed and false things and false ceilings and stuff. Is that I think even today they don't have a full picture of exactly how many passageways and things there are there, because they are still uncovering bits. Sinkhole. In the courtyard there was a sinkhole they told us about, where they think they found evidence of one of the tunnels they didn't know about. So they're still discovering stuff. Oh, and happy Thanksgiving to everyone over the other side of the pond, to the colonials out there with us. And this is the gate. This is the bit where me and David were just really, and Mag and Stephanie as well. We're just this is the moment, going into a place that I'd been, as I said before, reading about for years, and that is the entrance. That's looking from the castle back towards the town. And the prisoners would have got off in the train station in the town and been either trucked up or more likely marched up, and then marched across this bridge towards us through the gates. And the first ones who arrived in 1940, were the Poles were there first, and the first British contingent came in, and French contingent, etc., etc. And the radio room was only exposed. I'll show you a photo of one of the radios they had there later on, which I took there. So it was an amazing moment to go in there. And one of the things when you go inside there is you realize, or I realized, that this castle, my understanding of this castle, is mostly through the British lens. It's mostly through my experience, as I said, of the computer game, the TV show. Now, the TV show did show the Poles, it did show the French, but it was very much a British story I grew up with. And as you come in the door there, you realize that and this is one of the things I don't think I'd realized. I have also got sitting beside me, I've got the Henry Chancellor book, which I've had for a long time, and the Ben McIntyre book, which I got more recently. And I think both of those books talk about the fact that in 1933-34, Colditz was where they sent political prisoners of the Nazis. So people who were anti-Nazis, and there were deaths there. There were hundreds of people who were deported there, who died during this experience. And so that immediately was a reminder that the Colditz story of being kind of japes and pranks and kind of like a boarding school experience, which was part of the kind of the British experience there, wasn't the experience if you were a political prisoner of the Nazis taken there in 33-34. There it was a lack of rations, it was bad treatment, it was starvation, it was they tried various, I'm not going to go into a massive great rabbit hole here, but they tried various techniques of breaking people by starving them. And our guy told us how when you starve, but you starve people, you still give them water. It's a terrible way to go, because your internal organs start shutting down and you die very, very slowly. So that was immediately a reminder that my understanding of the Colditz history was blinkered from a British perspective. So hats off to those who lost their lives there, standing up against the Nazis in the mid 1930s. And as you go in the castle, you look through the windows. This is one of the this is the German admin area for the solitary confinement, or some of the solitary confinement cells, which to the left there, that was a bit you look through the window. We didn't actually get access to that bit of the castle. And I will talk about the what you can see in the castle day as we go on through the tour. And of course, when you go to a castle that was also a prison, you kind of have to take the obligatory through the iron bars type of photo, which is that kind of view that prisoners, some of whom were there for years, would have had there, that. And I'm not, although I'm saying that the experience of prisoners in Colditz was not as bad as the experience in other camps, it was a lonely time. And one of the things we heard about and read about was the impact on mental health of long-term prisoners. And like we talked about in the Stalag Luft 3 show last week, although a good number of men are involved in trying to escape and building means to escape and digging tunnels, a lot of the others are just not. They're just resigned themselves to seeing out the war. And, when we think about how long they were there, some of them. So I've been running World War II TV since the summer of 2020. I had a couple of videos before then, but that's when I started my live stream. So that's 4.5 years. So some of the prisoners were there for 4.5 years. So imagine, 4.5 years, with everything happening around you. You're getting older. Your wife back home is getting older. Your kids are getting older. You're not seeing your kids. Yes, there's letters. There's mail coming through, but the mental toll on people would have been bad, although far worse in other establishments run by the Third Reich. And there's me. I never look in the right place when I'm taking stuff. My eyes should be looking at the camera. That's me behind. They have cutouts standing in the courtyard. So that the chap on the right, the car is a real Dutch soldier, and the guy in the middle is one of the mannequins, the dummies the prisoners made so they could hide an escaper by having a fake guy attend the appel. And it was just a fake body made out of paper mache and what have you, and then you can stand yourself by that. And there's a wartime photo of the inner courtyard. Notice the very distinctive tower there with the kind of the circular bit on the top, and there's my contemporary shot, and that brown gateway in the middle bottom there is the gateway where, when you look online for photos of prisoners taken there, they all seem to pose in front of that gate there. There's photos of Pat Reed and other prisoners who were taken there in that area. And now we did a private tour. So let me talk a little bit about how the visit to the castle goes. So the main way you can visit it is you pay your entrance and you take a little iPad thing, and the iPad is one of those ones you hold it up and it shows you what it would have been like in the war, and then there's buttons you can press with people and all that kind of stuff there, and I will show you some photos of it later on. That's only been in place in the castle fairly recently, because since the war it's had various other uses. It was a hospital for some time. It was kind of in run down and in disrepair for a while. Then it gradually opened up to the public, and now it's got a much better visitor experience, and the iPad things are really good. I'll show you some photos later on. Now, I read online that the iPad experience does not get you to every publicly accessible area of the castle. So I booked the private tour as well. And the one thing and it really was just one extra thing we got to do in the private tour that we wouldn't have done on our own if we'd just done the iPad. We did both, was to go to the theater. And again, me and David were having to pinch ourselves going in the theater. So we were with our private guide there. Because the theater was one of the places you see it in the movie, although the movie wasn't filmed on location, but they recreated it there, was where one of the British escapes began under the stage, and they went through the ceiling to another room, and then they went through another bit. And this is the one where they actually kind of attempted to walk out and dressed as Germans. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole different escapes. You can read the books and read the Wikipedia, but to see the theater, again, a place I've been reading about and seeing in the TV shows and the films since I was a kid was really like. Oh, and David is watching today. He's doing the jokes from the theater, and the access bit from under the stage was kind of under where I pointed the camera there. So that left-hand corner under the stage was where British prisoners dropped through to the room below, and so on and so forth. So that was really cool seeing that there. Then that's back in the courtyard again. I'll just go through these photos, and if you want to pause them and look at them later on, you can. That's one of the German the British prisoners dressed as a German. That's Airy Neve. Now, Airy Neve is arguably the most famous of the prisoners who was in Colditz. I've got his book as well. They have their exits. And Airy Neve, you British people will know this, but if you're not British, you won't. He became a Tory or Conservative MP after the war. He also worked for MI9, I think, in World War II after, because he made a successful home run. I think he might have been the first Brit to make a home run from Colditz, but he then was employed by MI9 and MI5 possibly to work on giving prisoners better preparation for becoming, or giving Allied soldiers and airmen better preparation for being prisoners, and then working in the departments with the gadgets where they would send them eventually compasses hidden in walnuts and maps hidden in playing cards, all that kind of stuff. But he was blown up by the IRA in a car bomb. So back in the 70s sometime. So it's one of those stories that, again, Colditz was in the news when I was a kid, because when his death was announced, of course, they announced that Airy Neve was one of the prisoners who escaped from Colditz. So you literally couldn't escape. And well, yes, Barder and Sterling were also there. They were very famous, but they didn't escape. So I guess Airy Neve is the most famous of the escapers. Barder and Sterling were there, but did not escape. Although Barder did, I think, try to escape. I can't remember if Sterling did. So you couldn't escape the Colditz in the 1970s, pun intended there. Back in the courtyard again, walking around there. Now, the whitewash walls there is not how it was quite at the time. It was more kind of fresh stone. There's ivy over some of the photos you see in World War II, or some sort of creeping plants. There's a wartime photo. If you look at the top of that photo, you can see the ivy on the walls there, and you can see that the walls aren't that kind of whitewashed color there, and that's a real photo from the period. That's our guide there in the middle with the amazing trousers. Whether that's a German guide thing, but amazing trousers. And there's David on the left and Mag there, and that's in front of the doorway then. So the guide was very good, and he certainly gave us a lot of information about the pre-World War II history of the castle that I didn't really know. That said, I think David and I went in with a lot of prior knowledge, a lot of expectations, and maybe he wasn't quite as knowledgeable, but then we really wanted an incredible level of detail, and he was good, but we kind of wanted to get into the real nitty gritty of, was it behind that cupboard the escape came from? And he knew a lot, but he maybe wasn't quite attuned to what we wanted. But I accept the fact that that's not the door to the chapel. That's the door to the kind of main bit. The chapel is the other side. Or is it the door to the chapel? It might be, or the door to the chapel, maybe the one to the left. I forget which one it was now. Now that is the chapel. So maybe that was the door to the chapel. Now the chapel was interesting because it wasn't how I had anticipated it from the TV show and what have you. I've never been into a chapel before where there's like a first floor above it with windows around it. Chapels are not that kind of layout to me. So there you can see there's the altar. And then above it is these glass windows where you can walk around. And the chapel was a very important place for the prisoners because it was both obviously for those who were spiritual, for those who had faith. It was somewhere they would go to, and it was one of those places that the prisoners were never denied access to. Under the terms of Geneva Convention, they were always allowed certain privileges, and then some other things could be taken away as punishment. So, but I think the theatre was closed a couple of times as a punishment, but they never closed the chapel. They never stopped parcels getting through, that kind of thing. We talked about the TV show a minute ago, Tina. It's a seminal part of my youth. That's the chapel. There's our guide there explaining some of the stuff there to us there, and that was pretty cool going there. And at the back of the chapel, and this is an odd photo because the camera's facing down, they have a glass floor panel essentially showing you the French tunnel. Now the French tunnel, one of the French tunnel, was amazing because it kind of went up and down over multiple levels. It was never successful. One of the things that you find out when you go to the castle is that the most successful escapes were the blitz ones, the ones they kind of did suddenly, like the guy just leaping over the fence from the recreation area. The tunnel ones, the problem is so many people involved, they take ages, there's noise, and most of the time the tunnels ended up getting discovered before they were ever used. But there's another glass panel there where you can see through to the French tunnel, and that, I have to say, was amazing. Just standing there and looking at the incredible engineering behind the French tunnel, just extraordinary. I found the film, and I rewatched it, a little bit twee, a little bit of its time. The problem with the TV show, and it's not a problem as such, but it's the same with the problem about the books about Colditz, is that it's the books are structured in a way you wouldn't structure a TV show. So what do I mean by that? So the most recent book, the bestseller, was Ben McIntyre's book Colditz, and it's really good, and I enjoyed it. But kind of the last third of the book is kind of anticlimactic because, and I mentioned this in the Stalag 3 show last week, is that after 1944, the Germans really come down hard on escaping prisoners. They made it clear to across the Third Reich to all of their prisoners that escaping is no longer a sport, and you could be shot and you could get murdered and all that kind of stuff. And so the number of escape attempts plummeted because they just realized it was no longer a case of you get 30 miles and they pick you up and go tut 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 back to the castle for you. You could get shot. So the books reach a peak in the middle of the book when the prisoners start arriving there in 1940, and the first attempts don't go very well. Then they start getting out. As someone said there, the first 3 successful escapes were French. Although the bizarre thing about the French escapes is, of course, they can't do a home run as such, because France is occupied, or Vichy or occupied. So if you're a Brit and you do get back to Britain, you are back to some extent away from the war. You're back with your family. If you're a Dutchman or a Frenchman, or even worse, a Pole, you're going back home. Just it's from the frying pan to the fire. But nevertheless, they were still counted as home runs if they got back to their birth country, so to speak. So 42 was kind of the peak of the escapes. That's when Pat Reed gets out. That's when Erin Neve gets out. That's when the various other escapes. And then after 43, it's kind of an anticlimactic. So the books end up finishing without that kind of exciting ending. Obviously, the liberation comes, and then when they see American tanks coming through the town, but even the liberation had been slightly marred by the fear that the Germans were going to shoot the prisoners first. Of course, if you were in that part of Germany, even by early 1945, even maybe by late 1944, you kind of knew by then that D-Day had happened. You knew the Allies were pushing up in Italy. You knew that German cities were being bombed by Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force. So you kind of knew that the war was coming to a close. But as it got closer to the end, just like for the Japanese prisoners of the Japanese out in the Far East, there's this big fear that the SS or someone else is going to come in and massacre people, or as happened at Stalag 3, that you'd be marched somewhere else, marched further away from the front line. So, and this brings us to the glider that I'll get to later on when I get back to my photos. So there was the liberation came, and it was of course fantastic with the prisoners, but they had been so worried about the reprisals of the Germans that it took the shine off the liberation, because they hadn't really been they'd been worrying about a worse outcome than being liberated. Anyway, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent. So back to my photos. This one is an odd one because I wanted to try and convey one of my photos, the multiple periods that you see within the castle, in that you've got kind of, early 20th century brickwork with kind of 18th century moldings with kind of medieval walls. That's very much what it's like walking around Colditz. That's one of the things I liked about the iPad thing they give you to walk around, is that they didn't want to turn. The problem with turning an actual room into a display, if they turn one of the rooms to how it was in the 19th century, because you can also on the iPad see what it was like when whichever German king it was who was there, or baron, or I forget what it doesn't matter. I don't pick me up on this, but you can also find about the history of it when it was a castle with a I'll call him a king and a queen and their courtiers and that kind of stuff. And you can have that view with your iPad. You can see what it was like in that period. Of course, I was interested in the World War II aspect of it. So the French were moved out at one point, and the Dutch I forget whether the Dutch were moved out on. The French were definitely marched out in 1943, I think. I forget about the Poles and I can't remember. I think there were some other nationalities still there at the end of the war, and there was the Prominenti. The Prominenti were, some of you talk about in the sidebar, were the prisoners who weren't necessarily the high-profile escapers, but they were people that they thought were related to Churchill, or Mike Alexander was a commando. They thought he was kind of a prominent person, so they kept some of these. The Germans maybe to use in bargaining later on, like, we'll give you your important prisoner if you give ours couple back, blah blah blah, that kind of thing. And by the way, I'm not reading your sidebar stuff right yet because I'm trying to concentrate on this and the photos. There's another photo as we go we're looping down on the first floor now, down to the top of the castle and up to the glider. So the glider's in the attic. So the glider is a replica. They've also got parts of the replica the BBC made, or Channel 4 made, about 15 years ago for a documentary where they talked about the possibility of whether the thing would fly. And the glider, they've now got a replica glider which was made out of, wooden frame and then covered with bed sheets, blue and white bed sheets, etc., etc. And they were going to basically take down a section of the roof. That the wall at the back there was a fake wall. The prisoners, at the time, the prisoners had built a fake wall. Assuming the Germans wouldn't, excuse me, keep measuring the room to see if it was the same length, and they made a fake wall to cover up the last 6 foot. So I got a bit of a cough there. Just have a sip of water. Oh, and some in the sidebar, Jason Russell said he knew Mike Alexander. Oh, amazing. Why have I got a cough when I'm doing this? Anyway, behind the fake wall, they then constructed this glider, and then they were going to put it together, take down a section of the roof, make a kind of a runway of tables, then using a pulley system and an old cast iron bath, they would chuck the bath over the side, the ropes would pull the glider down the tables. Right, excuse me. And the glider would propel off into the sky. And the thing is, and this is what the guide was talking about, they're not certain as to what the motives of the glider builders were. Now, Bill Goldfinch was the main designer of the glider. He was involved in its building. And of course, after the war, like so many of the Colditz stories, he tells this kind of story about, oh, well, it was just to keep ourselves busy and we were just trying to get one over the Germans, all that kind of stuff. And there's obviously some truth to that. But there's a suggestion, our guide said, is that they really were worried about this potential reprise at the end of the war, and maybe the glider was a last-ditch attempt to get a couple of prisoners out to save them being murdered by the Germans now, or by the Gestapo, the SS. So it's interesting theory, because frankly, to get in a glider and hope they'd get all the elements together. Now, when they did this TV show where they built a replica, it did fly, and they say that aeronautically, there's no reason why the glider wouldn't fly. That said, you'd have to have perfect weather conditions. You'd have to hope that the Germans didn't see you putting hear you or see you putting the glider together. That the tables that would put down the ridge of the roof were perfectly aligned. That the bathtub would work, the ropes would work, and everything would actually propel this glider off there. So it never got used. So Mega Rebel is reminding us the Dutch were there to the end. So it's both a marvel of engineering. It's both a marvel that these prisoners could even have the idea for this and put this glider together. It's amazing. But if it was to be used in case of a desperate last-ditch emergency because the SS are running up the stairs murdering people, it does kind of give you pause for thought. Anyway, moving along. That's the Dutch tunnel. That's in another part of the castle. That's part of the Dutch tunnel there they're showing, which was another one of the attempts made, so this time by the Dutch. And they're still, as I said, they're still examining with penetrating radar and stuff, the walls of the castle. There are still more things they're going to discover, I think, in Colditz over the next few years. Back in the courtyard there. Now, and yeah, Colin, that's what they said. That's what Bill Goldfinch said, is that it kept them occupied. But I don't think after the war, the way the Colditz myth is establishing, not a myth, but the way that the story is being told of them all being heroes and blah, 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 I don't think they would admit that it was going to be something they would use in an emergency. So we don't know for certain. Everyone who was in Colditz has now passed away, so we can't go back and second guess. But anyway, so, and that's the entrance to the French tunnel, which is another floor below. And yeah, the fact they have all this stuff to see now is really extraordinary and really great part of the visit. And there's David, Stephanie, me, and Mag in front of the doorway, the same doorway you see Pat Reed and all those other guys. Now, this is an interesting part of the castle. I did this bit on my own because the others were kind of doing something else. They were kind of getting their iPads back. And this is the terrace where you come out to another level. And there was the famous, look it up after the show, the 60-second escape, which is one of the ones they kind of recreate in the film and the TV show, where they had to kind of make sheets, ropes made out of sheets, kind of a couple of guys would propel themselves out the wall to the right, down across the terrace, throw another rope down and do it and get down several levels, but all within 60 seconds because they had to do it within that, because that was the time they'd worked out when the guards patrol passed and when the searchlights would go through. And, you know, seeing the location of this famous escape, and I won't do the details of these escapes, you can read the book later on. Extraordinary to be there and see all this stuff, and brilliant stuff. And, you know, to think that someone just jumped over that wall there with a rope made out of bed sheets, crazy. Lots of plaques and things acknowledging the fact it was a prisoner of war camp and that the Germans controlled it, etc., etc. Yeah, so I was carrying my photos. So this is me going through later on with the iPad. So yeah, as I said, you hold up the iPad and it shows you the recreation. Now, I really liked it. The thing is, though, like those on that screen there, the guard room, you know, if you press those buttons, it tells you who those people are. All that kind of stuff, I would rather read that at home in a book. I wouldn't want to be in that castle reading all these background bios of the prisoners while I'm actually in the castle. What I'd be wanting to do if I was in the castle is seeing more of the castle. So it was brilliant, this technology, and I'm really glad they've got it. But I didn't press all the buttons because I'd have been there for hours, and you know, you're reading a screen when you could be actually looking at the site. But really well done, and hats off to them for being so inventive. And then you can click things where it will tell you how the theater escape worked and that kind of stuff. That's my hand there, and you get the gist with these. And they take you through the French quarters and the Belgian. Well, I say they take you through the French and Belgian quarters. What happens is the iPad works in the rooms where they already have display. So here's one of the circuits you can do. So you go in one of the doors and up and down a few flights of stairs. So they've got a nice level floor, and there are signs telling you what to look, and it's all well lit, and there's fire exits and there's things. And this is quite cool. As you go through one part there, you show one of the shafts, which again is where the French tunnel went, and they have a little system playing where there's like a video thing playing, so the lights move, and then when you see it, you see the silhouette of a Frenchman going up and down the rope, and you hear French voices, oh, zut alors, les Allemands. But it's really kind of cool. You hear all that as you go past. But the museum bit was really cool. The museum obviously has examples of the skeleton keys they used. It has examples of the rations, the gear they made. But for me, beyond seeing the exhibits, just hearing my footsteps walking up and down the staircases, where I had a couple moments on my own. Yes, they're available in multiple languages. As David said, the other three just couldn't face the stairs again. Yeah, my calf muscles were hurting at the end of it. But just spending time going up and down those steps and kind of imagining all the characters that went up and down those steps for as I said earlier, for years at a time. So the exhibits were fantastic. There's one of a sewing machine made by prisoners there in the middle, so they could theoretically make costumes for the theater, but of course make escape gear, make fake uniforms and that kind of stuff. These are some prints or art watercolors done by, I think, a French prisoner of his time in the castle there, which were amazing. And then there's a little bit about why the off flag was where it was, kind of right in the heart of Germany, furthest away from Switzerland, furthest away from the ports and that kind of stuff. Another part in the museum where they showed you kind of parts of another tunnel with ventilation pipes made out of milk tins, the Klim tins like they use in Stagler 3, that kind of thing. Back to the iPad again in the British quarters. And that's where the radio sets one of you made mentioned earlier, they only found this in the 1980s. They pulled down the bit of the castle. And I think at one point they had like 4 different operating radio sets there. One particular prisoner who ended up in the castle had been a kind of radio expert on a Wellington bomber or something, and had ended up in the castle. And he brought with him in his head all this technology of how to make radios and stuff like that. So there you go. Well, they did say in this thing, they did say Zuter Lork on it. It was one of the things I remember from the video. But yeah, you don't really hear. It's like an old-fashioned, antiquated phrase. But and there's one of the fake uniforms they made up there, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is all very cool. But my negative about the tour, and it's not a negative, but it kind of is a negative, right? Is that, and that's the last of my photos, I think, is that I would have liked to have seen inside more of the rooms, even if they weren't fully finished, even if you just kind of, even if our private guide had just had some keys and open up a door and saying, this is another room where the British were, and this is another room where the Dutch were, and this another, because apart from the theatre, the only bit of the castle that we got to that wasn't available to the regular members of the public was the theatre, you know. And I would have liked to have seen some of the other rooms and the private tour. You know, I said even there was nothing in them. If I would have liked to have a few more of the staircases and see, because I reckon within that the courtyard that was the bit where the prisoners were, we probably only had access to about 10% of it, 20% tops. And I would have liked to have seen, even if there's nothing in them, just to see more of the castle there. But that's not really a criticism as such. It's just that I like to have, I strive for perfection, you know, and I'd have liked to have seen a bit more of the castle. So there we are. And Maggie's reminding us she managed to escape the tour because she broke off to go to the toilet and then escaped. That clearly how the French did it back in World War II. So it was a really amazing experience to go there. And having been to Stag Love 3 the day before, to tick off within 24 hours 2 of my most wanted to see places in my life was really cool. I don't know that I necessarily want to go back. I think I've done it now. I've done both those locations. And I'm really pleased I went. And thank you, David and Stephanie, for taking us and all being the organizers. But I would have liked to see a little bit more of the castle to get a real sense of it. But what an amazing experience. And this is we had this private tour of whatever it was, 2.5 hours, and then we had the chance to go around with the iPad. Now I don't know how many hours were there in total, but we wanted to go and eat at some point because there's no food in the castle. So we could, and there was nothing open in town. It was Sunday in November, so we'd have had to go. We could have got back into the castle in the afternoon with our tickets, but I'd have gone somewhere to find somewhere to eat, then driven off and come back, and we were moving on to Berlin later that afternoon because we were doing a lot in our week there. So we didn't see where the escape was made under the theatre. There were more of the escapes. David was saying, the parcels office is such an important part of the books and the TV show. We didn't kind of get shown where that was. And so I wasn't, I don't want to come across as negative because that's not how I am. I'm not a negative person, and I'm thrilled to go there. I'm glad the cast is open to the public. I'm glad they have the iPads. I'm glad you can book a private tour, all that kind of stuff there. But I feel there maybe could have been a little bit more of the castle. But I guess, and this is the point, we're not its target audience. Its target audience is generalists. And in fact, our guide explained to us that where being a Brit of a certain age, Colditz is a huge thing. Most Germans have really no idea about what Colditz is. It's not part of their culture. That said, there were a good 20, 30 or 40 people walking around the castle that day with their iPads. But I did notice some of them were looking at spending as much time looking at the information about when it was a 17th, 18th, whatever century it was, castle as opposed to the prisoner aspect, whereas I was unashamedly only interested, well, not only interested, the guide had given us the background about the prehistory of the castle, which I found interesting. But once I was let loose with the iPad, I just wanted the World War II stuff. I would have liked to have seen a bit more. But I think, again, repeating myself, from the point of view of the Castle and Museum, they wouldn't think that an average audience would just want to see empty, dusty rooms. They are looking at a museum that has the experience of the iPad. There's exhibits and cases. It's all well lit. It's all well signposted. So, they get the tour that you do as a member of the public. You hear about the British experience, the French experience, the Dutch experience, the Polish, etc., etc. So I'm assuming that most of the regular visitors think it's a fantastic experience. I and David were just wanting for a little bit more, because we were more in depth. Now, Guy Walters, who wrote a book about the Great Escape, I don't think he's written about Colditz, but he does a tour with Tripsmiths. And I think they do a bit more of a detailed stuff of Colditz, but this is a tour that's been building over the last few years. They're a group of 40 or something, and what have you. So maybe they get to see a bit more of the castle. We were doing it on our own. I did specifically say when I emailed them, we are World War II buffs. Anything we can see that's cool, please let us know. And I say, I'm not criticizing the guide at all. He was knowledgeable, but he maybe wasn't the right suited for us. The other interesting thing, and it's about traveling generally, is to hear the perspectives from people who aren't yourself. Now, bearing in mind, during this week-long tour, we had been to Auschwitz, we had been to Krakow, Plaszow, the concentration camp where Amon Girth was. We then went Berlin later, Stalag 3. And over the course of the experience, you're hearing, of course, different versions of the German experience in World War II. So Berlin, the topography of terror exhibition there is in your face. This is the shit stuff the Nazis did. This is the book burning. This is that, and they're very clear in Berlin that the whole mechanism of the Third Reich, they were debunking the clean Wehrmacht myth. They were kind of saying everybody was part of it, blah blah blah. The Colditz thing, the guide was very good, but he was making that clear distinction between but the SS were the really bad guys, the Wehrmacht were just innocent, and there's some truth in that. But it was interesting hearing that perspective, because he was from a part of Germany. He would do tours of other castles as well. He was a medievalist, and I really appreciate hearing different people's points of views. And some of his stuff was what I would call old school interpretation of World War II, and in some ways buying into the British mythology of Colditz, because he was explaining to us about all these fantastic gadgets that people like Airey Neave helped develop in London as an escaped prisoner. And as I said, there's the compasses hidden inside walnuts and playing cards and records, 78 records you could split apart. Inside it was this, and then they would send other things hidden as capsules, so it was dyes, so you could dye uniforms certain colors. Now all this stuff was incredibly well invented, but the thing the guy didn't explain, or the museum didn't explain, it actually came too late for most of the escapes. The successful escapes were made earlier in the war, when they were literally improvising the stuff themselves. They were using boot polish to dye uniforms. They were making stuff out of all the tech that was the Q kind of gadgets really came a little bit too late to be of any use, and that wasn't kind of made clear. Does that make sense? So it's that was a point of view that I thought was interesting. That on the one hand, he was kind of talking about medieval history, but some of his stuff about the Colditz story, I think he obviously was brought to guide for us because he spoke English, and he was maybe giving what he thought us British wanted, which was that kind of boy's own adventure story of the plucky Brits getting one over the Germans. But what we really wanted was the truth. We wanted the nuance. We wanted although he did go on talk a lot about the mental health aspects, and he talked a lot about the medical setup in Colditz and how they were dealing with that, and how difficult it was for the the guards as well there being away from their homes, things. Anyway, so Phil is asking, how did the visit compare with Remagen? Very similar, really, in that it's that first vision, isn't it? It's that first when you were with us in the van, Phil, and we were driving up there, and we all first saw. I forget whether we saw the towers on which bank we saw first. It was 2 years ago. But when we first saw those twin towers, well, we all had that same heart in mouth moment, and that's what David and I definitely experienced looking up at Colditz Castle from the town. That real, oh my God, there it is. There is actually Colditz Castle. And the problem, and I kind of said this earlier, with going to anywhere that you've been wanting to go for most of your life, is that you're setting yourself up for disappointment, aren't you? You know, and I wasn't disappointed. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't disappointed. But if you've built up wanting to go somewhere for a long time, and of course it's going to be not anticlimactic, but your brain has built it up to be something so amazing that you're setting yourself up for disappointment. It's like going to a Michelin star restaurant where you've read 1,000 amazing reviews for it. You go, oh, this is going to be the meal that changes my life, and you haven't. It was all right, but maybe it wasn't quite as much as you're expecting. So there we are. And it's interesting, there's a point from Dennis there. As an American, I'm not sure why I'm watching, although I do know, thank you, Woody, I know nothing about movies or books, which I'm too old in America. This is the thing this is the real point here, is that Colditz is very much a British, French and Dutch story. Poles as well, although the Poles had a worse experience there because the Poles were perceived as a different class, literally, than to the British. So the Poles were treated worse by the Germans, as they often were in World War II. I don't know if American tanks fired on a castle. I don't think so. I don't feel that's a story, but maybe. So I'll deal with a couple of your questions now. I'll scroll back and see if there's anything in there that is interesting. So yeah, I would recommend going there for people, but I would maybe manage your expectations. You know, that you're not going to be just let loose to go up and down corridors and up and down staircases and open doors and see all these empty rooms, and which I kind of was hoping I would get, but you know, there we are. It is. So yeah, we'll see if there's any more questions coming in. The other thing, heart in mouth, Dennis. The other Dennis is saying that's the same way I felt when I visited Omaha Beach, and that's it. Your first time somewhere is always amazing, but when I look back to that time, as it was Saturday, not this Saturday just gone, the Saturday before, I think it was when me and David turned the corner with our croissant thing covered on chocolate. So a cross between a pain au chocolat and a croissant, but German. And we were just waiting for the girls finishing up their coffees or whatever they were doing. And we just turned the corner. And I said, David, and I called him down, and we both saw that view of the castle. That moment, I won't be able to repeat that moment again. That oh my God, there is the castle. And then he played the theme tune on his phone, and we kind of hummed it, and we went up there. But my more complicated, deeper thoughts about this whole experience of Colditz, and it's the same thing when I went to Stag Love 3, is as I get older and theoretically wiser, I wonder about really the merits of trying to escape. You know, just like with Roger Bushell in Stag Love 3, who got those 76 guys out, but 50 were murdered. Yes, a few men got home who escaped from prison war camps. Of course, that was fantastic. But this idea that it was, you know, damaging the German war effort, is that really the case? I'm not so sure. Did it not lead to more reprisals, more bad treatment of Allied prisoners elsewhere? Quite possibly, yes. But that doesn't take away from the, if you like, the spirit of adventure these guys had. And I can only wonder what would have happened to me if I had been confined in a prisoner of war camp. What would I have done personally? Would I have seen it as an opportunity to kind of educate myself? Because some people did that in prisoner of war camps. One of the things I'm a very admiration for the British Army or British military in World War II is its fantastic education programs. It's one of the reasons they suggest that the Conservatives lost the general election in 1945, is that they'd send out sent out tens of thousands of pamphlets about, working for a better Britain, and why Nazism is wrong, and what the world should be, and how we can better ourselves as human beings. And that idea that British servicemen got about, hey, yeah, we don't have to go back to how it was before. There is something better. I can get an education. I can better myself. I can do more than I was doing. That maybe is part of the reason that the Labour government got in that election, because people were wanting something new. And so maybe I would have been in a prisoner of war camp thinking, okay, this is my chance to do a kind of a correspondence course, because that was available. That in prisoner of war camps, you could take courses. And of course, that's just the stuff the Red Cross and the British Army would provide, or the British services. There were people in the prison who knew stuff, like in the Great Escape movie, Donald Pleasance teaching people about bird watching. There were people who were experts. You could learn the language. Now, in the series, in the movies, they always learn German or Dutch because they're part of the escape, but it's also part of educating yourself. So would I have got on with education, or would I have been one of those guys who dug tunnels? I don't know. I can only guess. One of the other things I learned about at Colditz and in rereading the books is that some of the prisoners just it mentally broke them. Mike Sinclair, the Red Fox, read about him afterwards, was one of the prolific escapers from Colditz. And it became an obsession, and it became an obsession at getting one of the Germans. And eventually, during one of his escape attempts, he was shot by the Germans and killed. And you wonder whether that attitude of trying to get out and being obsessed about getting out didn't actually do more harm than good. And these are the thoughts that go through my head as a 55-year-old male, is that I'm looking at life from a more senior point of view now, where I'm thinking about longevity. I'm thinking about leaving something behind. I'm not getting all morbid. I'm not croaking yet, folks, but you're looking backwards as well as forwards. And when you're 22, 23, and the age of these prisoners in the prisoner of war camp, you're living for the moment, and that is something they were dealing with. And so, as with everything else in World War II TV, the point is it's more complex than you think it is. And I love the TV series. I love the movie, the video games, all that kind of stuff there. The board game, although it was difficult to play, and we always ended up fighting before we finished it. But they present perhaps a rather singular view of this. A British officer's duty is to escape, when actually is not your duty to just survive as a human being and make sure you get back to your family in good shape. And if you've never seen the Colditz TV show, if you want to try one episode, you theoretically need to watch it in chronological order to get all the idea of it. But if you want to watch just one, the episode I recommend is called Tweedledum. And Tweedledum starred a British actor called Michael Bryant, who was only in that one episode of Colditz. And David and I talked about this when we were there, or at dinner afterwards. I forget when we talked about it. So Michael Bryant is playing a character who is a fictitious officer, but he's based on real life stories. And the story in the TV show, based on a real story, is he realizes that the Red Cross would repatriate people who had total mental breakdowns, people who were essentially mentally ill. They would repatriate them. And he thought, well, if I can convince the Germans I'm mentally ill, I'll go back home. And so he starts feigning mental illness. And I won't go into detail. Just watch the episode. It's on YouTube. Watch it. And the tragedy is he does get back home. And Jeffrey Palmer from Butterflies and all the other TV comedies he was in is the medical officer. And he reads, I may have said the same thing in the Stag of 3 show. I'm remembering I did say the same thing. And he reads the letter from this guy's wife saying he is back home. He's getting the care he needs, but he'll never be the same again. And this guy actually went mad. He by trying to be mad, he went mad, and it brought that whole question of the neutrality of the Red Cross, the Geneva Convention. If you're cheating in the Geneva Convention, if you're pretending to be ill when you're not ill, is that not taking advantage of a system that's there to look after real mentally ill people? So that's my favorite episode of the TV show, because it's very, very exactly, it's the one that everyone recalls. And Michael Bryant, who played the guy, was a renowned Shakespearean actor. He was a theatre actor. I don't think I saw him much on TV, and he gives an astonishing performance in that TV show. There you are. So, and yeah, the Dutch had more to lose. That going back to that whole prisoner thing is that the British point of view of Colditz is the British point of view. As I said earlier, the French, the Dutch, you can't do a home run. Your country's occupied. If you're Polish, you know, your country is not being just being occupied. It's being destroyed by the Germans and the Russians. So there you are. It is complicated. I will leave things fairly soon. Just to answer your question, Andreas, about Berlin, I may do a special about Berlin, but we really only went to Berlin to get the flights back to Paris. So we arrived at about 5 in the afternoon and left at about 2 o'clock the next day. So we did a whirlwind tour. We went out in the evening, did the Brandenburg Gate, had a nice meal, walked around a little bit. We did one of those hop on, hop off touristy buses round for a couple of hours next morning. We went to the whichever the ruined cathedral is, where they've got the old one in ruins next to the modern one with all kind of the modern stained glass inside it. We went outside the Reichstag, blah blah, but we didn't do much in Berlin. I would have liked to have done more. So that's really my concluding thoughts about Colditz, and I'm intrigued to know. Please leave some comments afterwards what your own understanding, knowledge of Colditz is. Is it like me? Is it from the TV show, the 1970s? So Pat Reed, who wrote the 2 books, the Colditz story and the latter days at Colditz, just seemed to be on every TV show all the time. There was that era when Douglas Bader, Pat Reed, and these other guys from World War II, some of the Battle of Britain pilots, just seemed to be on TV all the time. They were always on This Is Your Life, and they were on kind of the Nationwide and things like that. And Colditz, as a kid, you just knew that Colditz was special. But if you're American, it doesn't mean anything to you. There is, in the TV series, Robert Wagner, and there's one other American prisoner ends up there, but really there were no Americans in Colditz. There might have been 1 or 2, but it wasn't an American story. It's not part of American culture. But for Brits, it was part of our culture. If you're Dutch watching this, what's the Colditz? What does Colditz mean to you as a Dutchman? If you're French, now Mag doesn't remember the TV show, I don't think, or maybe she does, but her elder brother Thierry does remember the TV show in France, and it was on French TV, dubbed into French. Canadians, there were no Canadians, to the best of my knowledge, in Colditz. Plenty in Stag of 3, but I don't think there were any in Colditz. But please correct me if I'm wrong on that. But if you want to read one book about it, so the modern one is Ben McIntyre's book Colditz, and he tries to tackle some modern themes. He talks about the fact there were relationships between some of the prisoners, you know, what we would call homosexual relationships. He talks about the mental illness. He talks about that aspect. It's kind of a modern book looking at the complexity. There's also the escapes in there as well, but Ben McIntyre has done a very solid, modern, up-to-date interpretation. The book I prefer is the Henry Chancellor book, and I picked this up when it came out just to show off. Now I bought a limited edition one, so my one is signed in the front there. So that the affection. So it's signed by Bill Goldfinch, who made the glider. It's signed by Mark Alexander, signed by one of the Polish prisoners. It's signed by Connor Purdon, who was one of the commandos at San Jose. So that's my copy of the code, and that's more the book I liked. Because on the Indian Doctor, that's one of the best stories in Ben McIntyre's book. And I forget the guy's name now, but he was an Indian Royal Army Medical Corps officer, and the Germans wanted him because he wanted India to be separate from the British Empire. But at that time, he was serving with the British to defeat the greater enemy that was the Third Reich. But the Germans wanted him to be a traitor and work for the Germans against the British because they thought that they were his big enemies. And he was a supporter of Gandhi. He wanted India's independence, but he also was loyal to the idea of defeating the Third Reich. And his name escapes me. Oh yes, it's just come up in there. Chandra Bose. So yeah, that story is an amazing one of and he ends up, I think, being transferred somewhere else. So I'm going to go now because I am. Tomorrow we have Will Hogan coming on for a second time. Remember, his grandfather was his father was in charge of Task Force Hogan, the American armored unit, and he's going to be talking about Task Force Hogan in the Ardennes. So just to remind you what we've got coming up. So there are no exact theme weeks going up between now and Christmas. The reason being is it's very difficult to get people's schedules worked out this time of year. People have got Thanksgiving right now, there are Christmas going up, people are doing things. So basically it's going to be a scattergun approach. There's shows about the Pacific, there's shows about Italy. I'm really struggling to find any guests for next week. Everyone's available the following week, but no one's available next week. I've got 2 or 3 scheduled. Okay, that's not his name. That was someone else, Andres. Okay, my mistake. I thought we were talking about that. Yeah, so there'll be lots of shows coming your way, but no theme weeks. There's going to be, we're talking about hell ships, US submarines, Japanese submarines sinking hell ships. We're talking about aircraft carriers. There's going to be a show about the logistics of D-Day. What else have we got coming up? John Parshall's going to come back on for a part 2 about 1942. We're going to a panel discussion about the end of, well, not the end, but the 1944 part of the Burma campaign. Phil Blood is coming on talking about Nazis and the occult. That's going to be a fun Christmas show. So, yeah, where we are. So yeah, there was one American at Colditz, but it's not an American story like it is a British story. But I'm gonna leave you all to it. So I will see you all again. Thanks very much for your support. Just one final thing, views have still been pretty crap all the way through the summer and fall. It's not just me, it's across YouTube, it's across the board. Short format shows on channels are still doing well, but long format shows are just not being pushed by the algorithm. So my views are at the lowest they've been for about 18 months. But I don't need to worry about views because my loyal patrons, my loyal YouTube members are keeping everything afloat, and it doesn't really matter as long as those who are watching are enjoying it, and that's what really matters to us. But yeah, views are down, but people who are enjoying it are enjoying it. So thank you for all your support. Thanks for those who become patrons recently. In fact, I should have done that earlier. I've got my banner thanking people. I'll let that play for a bit. So these are the people who've signed up as a patron the last few days and weeks. So I will also do sometime around Christmas, but I don't know when, I will do a call-in show. So I will be hosting it like now, and then I'm asking not necessarily historians, but loyal fans, loyal people to come in, chat for 5 or 10 minutes about what they've been reading this year, maybe what their favorite shows were on the channel, where they've been with a World War II interest, that kind of thing. Maybe they want to talk about their family members in World War II. There are a number of people in the audience who I would love to come and talk a little bit about their family members. So I'll do that. I don't know when that'll be. Maybe around December the 21st, 22nd, something like that. I don't know, but I will set that up. So thanks to all the patrons. In the meantime, this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow night. Thank you very much for watching this, and thank you very much for your time. Cheers. Bye.